By 1 a.m., or 1 hour into the entire nationwide on the 4th, the two air assault battalions that had initiated the entire battle over the DFW International Airport had by this time effectively landed 4 of their 5 ground-based companies apiece, namely their 4 air assault infantry companies of each battalion, which made 8 companies altogether. By this point in time, by 1 a.m., both battalions with their transport aviation companies, which each battalion had 1, comprised of their Z-20 utility helicopters, were bringing in the mortar company of each of the 2 battalions, as each had 1 mortar company for ground-based fire support. At this time, fighting was in full swing on both the east and the west of the international airport, and even also the north, as 3 different armored battalions of the PLA 59th Reserve Group Army's 35th Armored Brigade were swinging into action and were attacking the outer American defenses, as the American defenders, both of the 156th Brigade Engineering Battalion, alongside of also the 3rd of the 133rd Artillery Battalion, which was effectively the artillery force within the 56th Infantry Brigade combat team, were holding the international airport grounds. These combat troops were defending the international airport alongside of an additional 500 American paramilitary alphabet SWAT-like elements. These effectively were filler units, more or less, that added to the defensive manpower of the international airport alongside of the American combat troops. As effectively, by this point in time also, the American forces had been cut off from their entire command element. Their independent headquarters company over the entire 56th Infantry Brigade combat team had effectively been hit heavily by the opening artillery barrage, as 300 millimeter fire from the PHL-03 battalion, as one of its comprising firing batteries was firing on the general vicinity of the headquarters company, as well as also elements of the 949th Brigade Support Battalion, alongside of howitzer fire from some of the firing batteries of the 4 howitzer battalions, as there were 2 battalions of the towed PLL-66 howitzers, which were 152mm, and there were 2 battalions of the towed PLL-01 howitzers, which were 155mm, comprising the howitzer-based artillery of the 19th Artillery Brigade, the chief artillery force of the 59th Reserve Group Army, as its maneuver brigades and its maneuver division, the 16th Infantry Division, within the 59th, also had artillery battalions of their own. The vast majority of the Group Army's artillery was still within the 59th Artillery Brigade, as it not only had its 4 howitzer battalions of towed artillery forces, but it had its 2 battalions of rocket artillery, the Type 83, which effectively was an upgraded version of the PHL-81 family, called the Type 83. This upgraded rocket system was a 122mm rocket platform artillery, and there were 2 battalions of these within the 19th Artillery Brigade, and of course the single battalion of the most potent artillery weapon in the 59th Group Army's arsenal, the PHL-03, with its massive 300mm rockets and their enormous payloads, as well as their range of approximately 80 miles, making this by far the deadliest of the artillery platforms in use in this battle. As the forces on the ground, including mechanized infantry, had light artillery assets, which were their fire support companies, effectively, which included heavy mortar/assault guns, as these could be used as direct fire weapons, these PLL-05s, which are a brand new dual-purpose weapon. They also used the old but exceedingly still effective, especially when guided by real-time AI battlefield data processing system or pre-prepared strike packaging, the Type 63 short-range, multiple-launch 130mm rocket systems. These weapons were kept in service due to their exceedingly high reliability, portability, as these were highly portable and mobile weapon systems and easy to operate and reload. They were quick to reload, making them exceedingly capable and reliable weapons, as these could lay down massive destruction and, alongside of the PLL-05s, deliver enormous fire support to the mechanized infantry formations on the ground, as each battalion had their own fire support company with typically 2 platoons of the Type 63 short-range MLRSs and the single platoon of PLL-05s. As the mechanized infantry troops moved into different areas, they could call down reliable ISR-directed firepower from these assets. As armed reactionary civilians would be encountered often, these 130mm systems could deliver excessive destruction to these very light forces. As in this particular scene, an IR pack created by the real-time AI battlefield data processing system through the use of the mechanized infantry company's quadcopter assets at the squad level had found a convoy of armed reactionary civilians and immediately called for fire from their fire support company, with the 2 firing platoons of these Type 63 systems from 1 battalion's fire support company lobbing an enormous barrage of 130mm rockets at this vehicle convoy of armed reactionary civilians, causing massive destruction. As these different rockets impacting are in various stages of exploding. This one had just literally blasted, as of this one and this one. They would shred vehicles and people inside to absolute pieces as shrapnel and debris from the shock wave of the blast itself and the shock wave would rip limbs apart, vehicle pieces apart, and throw them in many directions. As this car had been thrown 5 feet in the air, the remains of this scrap metal and these cars being thrown feet in the air as well, body parts and limbs ripped off. These barrages were absolutely devastating of these systems. And this was just from the 130mm light artillery from the fire support company within the mechanized infantry battalions. As the decapitation of the command elements was of the utmost priority in these different campaigns, within the Dallas-Fort Worth area battle, the 59th Special Operations Battalion had been guided through the real-time AI battlefield data processing system in surrounding the headquarters company over the entire defense forces in the city. It wasn't just the command elements over the entire 56th Infantry Brigade combat team, but by proxy also they commanded the 1st of the 204th, the SHORAD battalion that had been sent in to provide force protection for the Naval Air Station, which was also being heavily hit by this time, as well as also the 2nd of the 198th, an armored battalion, which was in Dallas, bivouacked on the eastern side of the downtown near the Deep Ellum area. As the 56th was in overall command of these attached units, and of course its own units, it was absolutely vital to the local PLA Trojan shock forces to capture the command elements, if possible, alive, which, to do so, their elite and high-tech Special Operations Battalion within the 59th Group Army were the ideal troops to do this. They were by far the best trained, and as the ISR network was all-encompassing and ubiquitous over the battle space, they had a direct bead on the position of the commanding general at all times, and purposely would avoid trying to do any harm to the commander himself while destroying all of the non-combat troops making attempts to defend him. As the elements of the 949th Brigade Support Battalion that retreated into this area trying to get to the Naval Air Station with the headquarters company were also being engaged by the Special Operations Battalion, who through the AI and the ISR network could see where all of the Americans exactly were, so they knew how to move in and surround them and where to do it, and created a cordon around these forces, and not only used their own special heavy weapons company with their artillery, or with their mortar platoon of 82 millimeter mortars to bring down massive destruction, as well as their robotic forces within this heavy special weapons company and their FPV drone operators, but they also called for fire from the rocket artillery as the Type 83 battalions would rain down enormous destruction on neighborhoods in this particular part of the city, just to destroy the non-combat troops trying to resist of the 949th Brigade Support Battalion. As the Americans would fight tenaciously in some cases and would try to put up firm resistance, ultimately they would be no match for the PLA Special Operations troops and would be shredded apart by the combination of these elite forces and artillery fire, as would armed reactionary civilians operating in the area with the American troops. As all of this was going on concurrently and fighting was erupting throughout the entire city, citywide, as the Trojan shock armies of the PLA went for all of their many myriad of various objectives, some far more important than others. They were mostly focused on the American regime, security forces, namely its military and paramilitary forces, although they effectively were forced to engage American armed reactionary civilians because they constituted a general threat. Although they were not the highest priority for the PLA troops, more often than not, they had to engage these elements because these elements were trying to engage them. For the most part, the PLA did not target the civilian population out of malice, but the civilian population suffered nonetheless through all the crossfire, as well as the enormity of the mass destruction of the weapons that the Trojan shock armies were utilizing, as the enormity of the air power from the heavy strategic bomber aircraft, as well as the massive artillery firepower, and even again the fires used by maneuver units were simply of a level of destruction that was unfathomable to the American population. As in the popular American imagination, they truly believed that they, alone with small arms, could fend off an invasion like this. They truly believed that, do that with small arms. What they understand is that without being properly organized, without being properly trained, equipped, and coordinated and logistically prepared, without adequate communications, with the logistical part of it being the most important of all, you can do literally nothing against an invasion like this, because the logistical situation for the Americans was effectively a basket case. As many of them kept their own personal supplies in their homes, many lost their supplies when their homes were destroyed, and then they had nothing to fall back on. They had no central command to organize and coordinate them. Most of them had no means by which to fight back against armored vehicles, as these armored vehicles didn't come alone. They came in groups. They worked as armored phalanxes, along with troops in body armor that worked in tactical formations that covered all directions of approach, 360-degree security, highly trained and motivated troops with heavy weapons support. The American civilian population learned the hard way that without communications, organization, coordination, and a real logistical system that worked, they could do nothing, because you have to, in order to make real defenses, be able to sustain your defenses. Without a logistical system, you can do nothing. Because when your supplies run out or they're interdicted, they're destroyed. As many of these people had fled their homes at the opening of the invasion. Speaking of the American civilian population, in the DFW battle, many went underground in the city's labyrinth of sewers and underground tunnels, where they would temporarily find rest and a reprieve from the fighting going on above, while many more had fled into the countryside, which was a very wise decision. While the reactionary sought combat and were completely and totally annihilated in all cases, as they had no idea what they were truly up against. As the remaining population that stayed above ground were gradually being destroyed hour by hour, they did their best to stay out of the way of the combat, although this was not always possible, again, as the crossfire, the airstrikes, close air support when called in against trouble spots, often resulted in enormous numbers of KIAs among the non-combatant population, as was often the case in these types of situations. Again, the PLA did not target the common civilian population out of malice, but they didn't concern themselves with what they considered collateral damage either. As the DFW battle at the airport was heating up, on the west side of the airport, the 3 tank companies of the attacking battalion from the 35th Armored Brigade coming in from the west conducted a pincer attack to surround and clear the defending local American company of combat engineers from the 156th Brigade Engineering Battalion. As their 2 armored infantry companies that were moving into the area with them were held back because they, after clearing the field with armor, would send in the 2 armored infantry companies who had not yet expended any of their logistics to clear a series of hangars for maintenance and storage of aircraft that were between the outermost diagonal-shaped runway running from the southeast to the northwest, which was far beyond this hill right here, as it sat effectively between the outermost runway and the innermost runways where these enormous terminal buildings are, which are way far off in the distance in this image. The hangars sat between the outer runway and the inner runways in these enormous terminal buildings. And the armored infantry, after the 3 tank companies of the attacking battalion coming in from the west cleared this area, would move in and clear the hangars as the armored companies that attacked, the 3, would replenish their logistics. But at this very moment, at 1 a.m., the attack was in full swing on the western side, with the 3 tank companies conducting their pincer attack. In the north, the tank companies and the 2 armored infantry companies attacked together to take the entry and exit in the north of the International Boulevard, which bisected the entire international airport as it ran literally in between the 2 sets of terminals and 2 sets of runways on the east and west side. As the attack in the north from that attacking battalion in the north captured the entry and exit way, they would hold their position and clear the local buildings with their armored infantry company that spearheaded the assault, as this was underway right now, and they would take about an hour to do so and replenish their logistics as they would coordinate their operation with the battalion attacking on the west and the battalion swinging in and attacking from the east, as the fighting on the eastern side involved more American defenders than the north and the west, as the west had 1 company of combat engineers that at the time before the invasion was setting up defenses in the area, namely a minefield of M19 anti-tank mines and a series of small earthen bunkers and observation posts for also machine gun positions to guard the minefields to prevent sapper-type elements from clearing the mines. In the event of any type of attack of sorts, they had no idea a full-scale invasion was coming, and they never were able to finish this project, and thus were destroyed as their company was out continuing the work that they had set out to finish in the field that lay beyond the outermost runway and the perimeter fencing of the grounds. As in the east, there were 3 American Combat Company elements, as there was, if we go to the map, in the north, on the eastern side, one of the 4 firing batteries of the 3rd of the 133rd. In this position created by the combat engineers, more earthworks like in the golf course positions that had been destroyed by the air assault battalions and their 2 combat aviation companies, 1 per battalion. As in this area, the same was the case with the earthen berms, the earthworks, and to their south, as this was the outermost runways on the eastern side, to their south, effectively, was another of the 4 combat engineer companies, as there was 1 in the west, 1 in the north, and 2 on the east, on the outer perimeter. There was this combat company of combat engineers taking up positions as they created for themselves sandbag fighting positions on this side of the International Airport grounds for both their vehicles, and they could dismount their troops to take position, but they would never get to, as the airstrikes and artillery strikes would hit them before they could dismount all of their troops from their vehicles, as they were sitting inside their vehicles playing cards and doing things that soldiers often do. They didn't see the attack coming. Even a DH-10A cruise missile would hit their TOC and campsite, their Tactical Operations Center, and their campsite established by and for their headquarters platoon. A DH-10A strike would hit along with the airstrikes from a JH-7 strike aircraft, dropping 4,000 pounds of HE munitions on this site, along with enormous artillery strikes hitting this area, coming mostly from the 35th Armored Brigade's own artillery battalion, as they had 56 howitzers in their firing batteries, organized in their firing batteries in this battalion. They were fully at this time focused on the International Airport battle, as the first 45 minutes at the opening of the invasion, they had spent firing in support of another of their armored battalions fighting on the flanks against armed reactionary civilians, and after the first 45 minutes, they had shifted their entire battalion to firing in support of the airport capture and seizure operation, as this was far more important. But they had already smashed the armed reactionary civilians on the flanks by this point anyhow, as their artillery fire was simply too much along with their armored assault against them. They now could focus their entire effort on bombarding the American defenders at the International Airport, as they would fire on the north, the west, and the eastern side of the International Airport defenses. As in this area, this company of artillery, or firing battery, if you will, as a company in artillery terms is a battery, would be hit by airstrikes from 1 J-10 and 1 J-11 fighter aircraft, as these were among the 2 pairs of fighters that were equipped with extra air-to-ground munitions, as the vast majority of their armaments were still air-to-air. They, instead of having only 2 air-to-ground munitions, they had 4 air-to-ground munitions in the form of 4 1,000-pound laser-guided precision munitions, and these 2 aircraft from each pair of fighters, as there was a pair of J-11s and a pair of J-10s, these 2 aircraft, 1 J-11 and 1 J-10, would drop their 4,000-pound laser-guided munitions on these artillery forces to avoid hitting the airstrip, as this again was not to be hit by air, missile, or artillery strikes, and again there would be an overzealous artillery captain who would disregard the advice of the real-time AI battlefield data processing system and sanction artillery strikes on the runway to hit these retreating forces as they tried desperately to flee. This one was right off the airstrip, but it was sanctioned as it was deemed it would do minimal damage to the airstrip, but these were actually on it, and the artillery captain that ordered the FDC to send the fire mission down would be called to the carpet and severely reprimanded and threatened with removal of his commission as an officer if there were any more such mistakes or discrepancies made again. As the loitering munitions had been fired in a salvo of 48, there were some more to the south, as this was only 28. There were 20 more to the south, as there was an area between this map and this map wherein there were paramilitary forces and elements of this company, as this company held a position in an L shape, as they held an area between this map and this map, this combat engineer company. They effectively would fold down and retreat, attempt to retreat across the car rental drive, which was one of the airport roads, which ran in an east-west direction, And they and the paramilitary forces with them that were between this map and this map, as there was paramilitary forces and campsites along the runway in this area between these two maps, as this area and this area were a mile apart. They were a full mile apart, were paramilitary campsites spread along the field and the airstrip, and there were buildings and overflow parking beyond where the airstrip ended, as there was a parking garage right here with sandbag emplacements to where a squad could watch the road. This area, because International Boulevard, which bisected the entire international airport between east and west as it ran north-south, effectively to the east of it was where a lot of overflow parking garages and areas were. And these forces, which were the other combat engineer company being mentioned, were in an L shape and held the area between this map and this map, along with paramilitary forces. This was a paramilitary QRF force, or quick reaction force, at the time racing in as the airstrikes and missile strike were coming in, and the PLA tanks and armored infantry troops were coming over the berm, as there was a berm on the other side of this service road, just barely off the map, as the 2 of 3 tank companies came in this direction, 1 armored infantry in the far north toward the artillery battery. The artillery forces, before they were completely destroyed by airstrikes, as they saw the first armored infantry troops coming over the berm, fired HE shells, high explosive shells with point detonation fuses, when they used their red charge, number 7, which is the highest charge they had in these vehicles, and they fired them at a high velocity against the armored infantry vehicles. And as they slammed into the berm, would end up destroying an armored personnel carrier, one of the Type 89As, and it was full of troops, so they wiped out a whole squad. And they would even get a direct hit as they bore-sighted these onto an IFV, one of these ZBDO-4As, which also wiped out a whole squad of troops. But as they did this, the airstrikes literally came in on them as the vehicles were literally coming over the berm at the same time to have a bit of a shock effect, as they were also coming over the berm firing, and they destroyed these paramilitary Max Pro MRAPs with their 50 cals that they were issued as crew serve weapons. They destroyed these as they came over the berm, the tanks and the armored infantry troops, but they in turn had been hit by some of the artillery fire, that they only got out 3 shells right as the airstrikes and artillery started coming in. The counter battery fire was immediate, as they already had the pre-prepared strike packages and the artillery missions were being done right as this was happening. It was all so fast. It all happened very fast. Loitering munitions came in and got troops from the headquarters platoon trying to flee, along with artillery strikes, including the ones that were not to have happened but were sanctioned by the artillery battery captain of the battery responsible. They destroyed all of this with artillery, with the airstrikes from the J-11 and J-10 striking this battery. They completely wiped them out, and the loitering munitions assisted in this as well, along with a lot of HJ-10 fire coming from the attacking battalion's anti-tank company, which effectively was their fire support company, firing salvos of the very powerful and long-range HJ-10s, as these had a very long range for an ATGM, as they maxed out at 6.2 miles. Over twice what the TOW missile was that the Americans possessed. And as the combat engineers were hit heavily by a DH-10A cruise missile strike, a JH-7 strike dropping 8,000 pounds, destroying this whole platoon with 4,000 pounds, and hitting, along with artillery and the cruise missile strike, this entire headquarters platoon with another 4,000 pounds of air-to-ground. This platoon was destroyed by artillery, 4,000 pounds of air-to-ground from this JH-7, while the other JH-7 hit this. And then there was still the other pair of JH-7s to the south, with this J-10 joining them and this J-11 joining them. They were hitting the campsites that this company was now fleeing, but also still hitting some campsites with paramilitary forces, like this other J-10 hitting a paramilitary campsite with 2,000 pounds of air-to-ground munitions, also destroying their Max Pro MRAP QRF vehicles. This is a car rental building that was now being fired at by PLA troops who had interlocking fields of fire, as this entire platoon of 5 squads had got into their line positioning alongside of the berms to form a wall against the Americans who were hurling themselves at these PLA air assault infantry troops. And there were still some loitering munitions in the area as well, as they threw themselves at the Chinese, as the Americans threw themselves at the PLA forces, as the airstrikes were happening in the north, destroying the artillery battery there, as well as also the other combat engineer company with the J-10s, J-11s, as there was a pair of J-11s, pair of J-10s with 4,000 pounds each, laser-guided munitions, and then the 2 pairs of J-7s. This combat engineer company was fleeing as the PLA tanks were coming up and over the berm, as the Type 96Bs and also the armored infantry company with them, as there were 5 attacking companies. 2 tank companies and 1 armored infantry were attacking on this map to the north, as the airstrikes, artillery, loitering munitions, and HJ-10 strikes began to come in. The vehicles crossed at the same time, and the artillery again managed to get 2 PLA vehicles and 2 full squads. But in the south, in this area, the fighting here was absolutely desperate, as the company captain yelled retreat, and the communications were difficult due to line of sight, and there only being line of sight and effectively earshot communications and runner-based communications due to the communications down situation. The captain did the best he could to rally his troops to retreat, and the retreat became a desperate gamble at trying to break through the PLA lines of their air assault infantry troops holding the line, who had full support from their attack helo gunships, which were firing their very powerful 25mm chain gun, their ATGMs, which were a mix of HJ-08s on some of the helos and AKD-21s on some of the others, as 4 of these attack helo gunships had HJ-08s, and the other 4 had AKD-21s. This was one company from one air assault battalion, the air assault battalion responsible for the southeast side, and one air assault infantry company was holding the line along the drive, along the car rental drive, holding back the forces as this squad and this squad were trying to cross desperately with this platoon of vehicles. Their M1150 armored engineering vehicle, 2 Bradleys, and 1 M113 APC were trying to cross, and these troops were getting cut down by the ground-based fires as these squads in this platoon tactically bounded and covered. This was their platoon leader and platoon sergeant, as well as combat medics, 4 of them that ran up to assist with these squads if there were any wounded, and there would be wounded and even several KIAs in this group of air assault infantry. But the Americans would suffer, of course, the most in this battle, because they were desperately throwing themselves, and it was becoming a rout, as literally above them in the space between this map and this map, 1 armored infantry company and 1 tank company were moving into that area. They were entering the airport grounds right behind the retreating combat engineers, as the battle was becoming horrifyingly desperate. The company captain got literally to the other side of the road, but was destroyed by a combination of 25mm fire as well as ground-based fire from these 2 squads, as he broke through the middle railing in his up-armored Humvee and tried to come up over the berm and was destroyed. The loitering munition strikes, ATGM strikes, 25mm fire shredded these vehicles to pieces, like this Bradley in the process being shredded up by 25mm fire, about to also be hit by a loitering munition with an HE warhead. 25mm fire shredding this armored M1150 armored engineering vehicle to pieces. This APC is completely annihilated in multiple pieces and burning. This 50 cal gunner on this M113 is trying to put up the best fight he can, but the rounds are tearing up the APC from the rifle fire and light machine gun fire, as these APCs had weak armor, the M113s, but the Bradleys, they were much better armored than the M1150s, but even they could not withstand the very powerful attack helo gunship's 25mm chain gun, nor could they withstand 70mm rocket strikes from their rocket pods, or, of course, the ATGM strikes. As the ground troops also had the man-portable HJ-08 ATGMs, they were firing these at the American vehicles, along with the light anti-armor weapons, which also had anti-personnel rounds for the Type 69s, which were fragmentation rounds, which were devastating against infantry troops, as well as the light anti-armor rockets being devastating against APCs, and also causing some damage to the IFVs, but they were mostly highly destructive against the M113s, but the HJ-08s could have killed any vehicle on this image in this map, because the HJ-08 was an ATGM that was highly effective and could destroy main battle tanks, and it could definitely wipe out all these vehicles. The fuel truck, Max Pro MRAPs, the HET, Heavy Equipment Transporter Truck, the M88 Armored Recovery Vehicle, all these vehicles of these platoons and the headquarters platoon and the 3 combat platoons were trying to retreat in this image. These troops were trying to retreat individually, and they were just getting cut down by all the fire, ground-based and aviation-based. It was absolutely devastating as these PLA troops in this company, as this platoon, bounded and covered tactically and got in a line formation, and this one moved into this area, getting into a line formation, bounding and covering tactically, exchanged fire with paramilitary troops who were getting tore up by ground fire as this squad lay down covering fire while these troops bounded and covered and took their positions. And they all had interlocking fields of fire tactically, along with the support from the attack helo gunships, which rained down rocket fire, 25mm fire, and HJ-08 ATGM fire, which devastated paramilitary just off this map and on it, as all these forces were being annihilated brutally by all of this firepower. This and the final battle map of the International Airport battle will be covered in the next installation of this particular documentary series on 4th generation warfare doctrines, highlighted through the guise of a Sino-Russian coalition invasion. More to come in the next installation.